I will never forget the stories that I have heard from the lips of survivors. There's something when we have the privilege to be witnesses to those who have witnessed unspeakable acts of terror and brutality that stick, I think, with a human being. And I was particularly thinking about some of the stories that I remember Doris Small telling. Some of you will remember Martin and Doris Small. Some of you are here since they've been gone. But Doris Small grew up in Berlin, and by the time she was 14, both her parents had died. And through an old business connection of her father's, she managed to get onto the Kindertransport from Berlin. And she used to tell the story about going and getting on that train and seeing her best friend, Fritzi, saying goodbye to her parents, and thinking as a young girl, in that moment, I was so grateful that my parents were dead because they didn't have to go through what Fritzi's parents went through. And the thousands of children who said goodbye to their parents, and their parents not knowing if they were ever going to see them again, and the children not knowing if they were ever going to see their parents again, and the way in which that impacted the lives of all of those people. And there are so many other examples of that. I'm very moved. 2 summers ago I did the Ride for the Living, which is a 60-mile bike ride from Auschwitz to Krakow. And that route, the 60 miles, was the same route that a survivor called Marcel, as a 10-year-old boy who was liberated from Auschwitz, walked with 2 other boys who had survived Auschwitz. They walked the 60 miles to Krakow, to empty houses where they had grown up, where there was no one left. And eventually Marcel was actually reunited with his mother, who had also survived. I'm telling these stories because every moment for us, of course, such a narrative, and as we see the whole generation of survivors who are so dwindled, and there are so few of them left, but many of us will have had the privilege, and I do consider it a great privilege, to have had relationships with survivors. Irene Rosenshine, who many of us knew and loved, Martin and Doris Small, Bill Safran, who is still alive and now living in Northern California. But these people whose stories are just so impactful. Of course, Michelle's father, who told his story so many times. But so many of the stories, and of course for us it's the Holocaust, but so many of the stories of human civilizations where there is terror and war and conflict and genocide is about family separation and the horrific nature of what happens to a family when children and parents are separated from each other, and the impact that has. And we think about immigrants and undocumented people here who may be separated from their families. We don't know what's going to happen. We think of the hostages in Gaza who are separated from their families for all of this time, and still no real deal seems to be in sight right now, and just the horror of those families not even knowing if their kids are alive or dead. And of course we have to also think of the horrific suffering of the Palestinians too, and the number of parents and children who've been separated either through displacement or through death. And it's just horrific. Like any human being, we all have had parents. We either have living parents or we've had parents. We don't all have, but most of us have siblings. Some of us have grandchildren. We have cousins that we're close to, and it's just the bonds of family. One of the lines that Yehuda says that really gets to Yosef is nafsho kushura b'nafsho. His soul is tied up to the soul of his son. He's talking about his father Jacob and the connection that he has to Joseph, right? The bonds of parent and child are so incredibly profound and deep. And it's heartbreaking when parents and children are separated. And that story, when Doris used to tell that story, as a young girl, just feeling grateful that her parents didn't have to go through what her best friend's parents went through. And so many examples throughout human history of that, not just for Jewish people, of course, but for many different civilizations. And so I want to connect that to the moment where Joseph and Yaakov that we read, the moment where Joseph and Jacob actually see each other for the first time. First time in 22 years, right? Joseph has Jacob perhaps has always held on to some notion of hope that we don't really know. Did he absolutely? In the same way that the families of the hostages, like some of them hold on to hope, like, Bruce, I spent a lot of time with Rachel and John Hirsch's parents, Paul and Goldberg, and just the anguish of then knowing that their son was alive and then he wasn't alive anymore, and just the brutal pain of that. And just the people who are still holding on to hope that their loved ones are alive, but not knowing. And so Jacob, did he hold on to a shred of hope that he might one day see his son alive again? Or was he sure when his sons brought him that coat with blood on it that he had in fact died that day 22 years earlier? We don't know. There are different commentators. Some suggest that he never fully gave up hope. Most think that he had assumed him to be dead all of those years. So when his sons come back to Canaan and tell him, Joseph is still alive, can you imagine the impact that would have? And there are stories like that. There are stories like that even to this day of Holocaust survivors who are suddenly reunited with a relative that they had assumed had died. And they're these incredibly moving stories. There was one just last year about two brothers who were reunited and they had both assumed the other had died in the camps. And there's just something about that. There's this kind of fear that they're going to break Jacob's heart again by telling him, and is he going to even believe them? It's like, it says Vayifog, he was in a daze about whether it was really true or not, but then once he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent up, and he said, wow, maybe this is really true. I'm going down. He's an old man. I'm going down. I'm going to see my son again before I go to the grave. Powerful moment. And then you look at the text, and there's two. I don't know if any of you still have a chumash. I don't know if they've been put away or not, but there's just two verses that describe this encounter, and they are so worthy of exploration because it's so unclear what is really happening. Early on, at the first Aliyah, I asked the question that we didn't answer: who kisses who? Who cries? Because that's a question that Rashi asks. It's a question that the commentators ask because it's not clear. And I'm going to read the verses. So it's verse 20, verse 29 from chapter 46. And the first three words in themselves are mysterious because it says, Vayasor Yosef mekavto. Does anyone have a chumash open? Because it's the most terrible translation. How does it translate that verse?
Joseph ordered his chariot.
Joseph ordered his chariots. That's not what it means at all. Vayesor means he tied up, right? Asurim, in the morning blessings we say Matir Asurim, which means who unties those who are tied up, who releases the captives, right? Asurim are people who are captive. But La'asor means to tie up. So really what it means is Joseph tied up his horses. And the reason that it's translated like that is because, well, of course Joseph wouldn't tie up his own horses. He was the second most powerful man in the whole of Egypt, so he had people who did that for him. But there's many of the commentators who say, no, he was so unbelievably excited that he was going to see his father again, that he did something that he would not normally do. He himself tied up the horses. And then the Kabbalists and the Hasidim go crazy about these lines because the chariot is the Merkavah, and the Merkavah is a symbol of Jewish mysticism. So there's an unbelievable commentary in Kedushat Levi, in Rabbi Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev, who says that in those three words, Vayesor Yosef Merkavato, it says Perush, the interpretation is she'asah haguf. She'asah haguf shehi muchav me'arba yesodot. In that moment, he completely tied himself to the experience of the oneness of God through the Merkavah. And it wasn't just about a reunification between a father and son. It was about a reunification of earth and heaven, of body and spirit, of soul. I'm not going to go more into that, but it's just an example of how sometimes when we deeply study the verses, there is so much to unpack. So whatever actually happened, it seems like Joseph actually tied up the horses, rode the chariot, went out to meet his father, right? V'ya'al likrat Yisrael aviv, Goshna, went to meet his father in Goshen. Vayei ra elav. Not clear what it means. He saw him. Who saw who? Did Joseph see Jacob, or did Jacob see Joseph, or did they see each other? Not clear. Then it says, Vayipolat savarav vavech. And then he fell on his neck and he wept. Va'al savarav od, and wept more on his neck. Not clear. Who fell on whose neck? Who cried? Right? So there is this extraordinary Rashi, the primary sort of commentator of the Middle Ages, who says it's all Joseph. It's all Joseph. Joseph is the one who harnessed his own horses. Joseph is the one who ran out. Joseph is the one who was extremely emotional. We've already seen him cry when he reveals his true identity to his brothers, right? In fact, the first time he sees his brothers, when they don't know who he is, he cries, right? He cries. He's a crier, right? And then he falls on his brother's neck, which is so interesting because last time we saw someone falling on someone's neck was who? Yaakov and Esav. Yaakov and his brother Esav, in that reconciliation, when it says that Esav fell onto Jacob's neck and kissed him, but there's a whole kind of idea about that he didn't really kiss him, he tried to bite him because he was still angry with his brother, and in that moment the angel Gabriel turned Jacob's neck into marble and all of Esav's teeth fell out. But that's a mean commentary, because really there seems to be, just as there's been a reconciliation between these two brothers, here there is a reconciliation between a father and a son. And you would think that it would be a mutual kind of embrace and a mutual kissing and a mutual crying. But Rashi says no. Joseph was the one who fell on his father's neck. Joseph was the one who kissed his father. Joseph was the one who cried. Why? And this is just so extraordinary, and I don't know what to do with this. Why? Says Rashi, because the rabbis say that in that moment, Yaakov was reciting the Shema. So it's like in the middle of davening, and he's too busy to greet his son that he hasn't seen for 22 years. Like, why would the rabbis suggest that? Why would the rabbis say, like, Joseph was all emotional, Joseph fell on his father's neck, Joseph kissed him, Joseph cried, whilst his father was saying the Shema? Any thoughts about why the Midrash would say that?
Well, Shema, maybe that he was thankful. That instead of him crying, he was like.
So he was saying Shema. I'm going to repeat what people are saying just for the sake of people who might be watching on live stream. So Leslie Kimmerling is saying that perhaps him saying the Shema was an act of offering praise and gratitude for the reconciliation.
He thought he was going to die.
Okay. The Shema is traditionally something we say right before we die, so Sarah's saying maybe he thought he was going to die.
His eyes were covered.
Leslie says his eyes were covered, so meaning he didn't even see his son. He had his eyes covered saying the Shema, so perhaps he didn't even see his son. Shoshana?
After living in Egypt for so long, like having this reminder of like the culture that he came from, with like even the Shema, like maybe, I don't know, maybe it's the first time he's heard the Shema, like.
Oh, and that's why he cries. Oh, maybe. So Shoshana's suggesting that Joseph has been so embedded in the culture of Egypt that perhaps when he sees his father's saying the Shema, that's what makes him cry. Michelle?
So Joseph knew pretty much that his family was still surviving, but the opposite wasn't true. They didn't know that Joseph was still alive all this time, and all of a sudden, so it's like Chayei Meitim kind of.
Yeah.
It's just the opposite of dying. It's somebody
Right.
is coming back to life. So he's saying it.
So Michelle is saying, in a way, it's the opposite of dying. It's like a Mechayei HaMeitim. It's bringing the dead back to life because they have assumed for all these years that Joseph is actually dead. And yes,
I
Cass.
don't think Yaakov's ever been really in touch with his feelings. No, seriously. I mean, throughout his life, he has, I think, trouble expressing his feelings. He sort of keeps very much to himself. With Dina, for example, the whole experience with that, he doesn't express himself.
So Cass is saying that Yaakov has trouble expressing his feelings. He hasn't really expressed himself. Although when he first set his eyes on Rachel, he did burst into tears at the well.
But she's the one who fell off the camel, which is sort of stood.
No, that was Rivka.
Oh, that was Rivka. That's right. Well, maybe he was.
Right.
Yes, Mark.
He's also very self-absorbed, and everything is about himself. When he says, "I will surely die if you don't, if Benjamin doesn't return to him," or something of that nature. Focusing on what effect it will have on him, as opposed to all the other consequences that might ensue. So here he is, self-absorbed, and I'll deal with this in a couple seconds.
So Mark Lowenstein is suggesting that he's been self-absorbed throughout, and here he is self-absorbed again, thinking about how this whole reconciliation is going to impact him, and that he'll deal with the meeting in a second. I don't like any of these. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Let's see if Rav Jacob can redeem us. What do you think?
I support the interpretation that he is like preparing to die, because the next line he says is, "Now I'm ready to die." Because now I've seen you alive. That's now I can. This time I can die. I don't know. Just also seeing some of my elderly relatives who know that they are close to death. Even in the way that Jacob responds to Pharaoh, it just seems like he's just like ready to go. So I just think his orientation is like, all right, these are the last things I'm doing. So maybe he's like always saying the Shema.
And the Shema has his own name in it. Shema Yisrael.
Right.
Rav Jacob just supported Sarah Sturtz's commentary that is saying that he's preparing to die, because immediately the next line is, "Now I can die." Now that I've seen my son again, now I can die. So there's that kind of sense. There is an extraordinary Hasidic commentary on this rabbinic midrash from a Hasidic rabbi called Rebbe Yisrael of Chortkov, who says that the meeting of Jacob and Joseph is in itself the recital of the Shema. Because the Shema is all about a reunification, so there's something, and this ties in, I think, to the Kedushat Levi interpretation of the chariot and the unification, that there's something about when a father and a son are being reunited in this way, that it represents a yichud. It represents a reunification and in such a powerful way that it's not just about one family coming back together. It's about a universal kind of coming back together, a kind of achdut, a oneness and a brotherliness that is really part of the reconciliation. Because part of the whole journey that the brothers have been on, in terms of their own teshuvah, so to speak, because we can look at the way in which Joseph has manipulated this whole story to come about, right? The different ways in which he first took, like, he said, "You're spies, you've come to spy out the land." Then Shimon was put into jail and the brothers went back. And then he made them come back again with Benjamin and this whole kind of thing. And it's so, the build-up of the drama of that story. But like, there are some commentators who really feel like it was deliberately to achieve what Maimonides and others would call teshuvah gemurah, a complete teshuvah, because he took the brothers through a process where they really could see the impact, even though they didn't know it was Joseph, the impact of what they'd done. And then they were able to be fully repentant. So by the time Yehuda is basically saying, I'm going to just be a slave, take me instead of Benjamin, it's a complete reversal of what happened, because it was actually Yehuda's idea to sell Joseph into slavery. And now he's saying, I'm going to be a slave instead of you taking the younger brother. And so there is this kind of repair that's going on. So all that is set up before even Jacob kind of comes back. And there is, when you look at the Meforshim, the medieval commentators, it's so interesting to see when they agree and when they disagree with each other. So Nachmanides, Ramban, absolutely categorically disagrees with Rashi. And he says that the correct reading of this moment is that Jacob's eyes were already somewhat heavy with age, so that when Joseph arrived in Egypt's second chariot of state with the mitre over his face in the manner of Egyptian royalty, and was therefore unrecognizable to his father, and his brothers hadn't recognized him either, the text relates how after he appeared to him and he'd looked closely and recognized him, he, Jacob, fell on his, Joseph's, neck and wept, just as he had wept for him throughout the time he hadn't seen him until that very day. After that, Jacob said, let me now die after seeing your face. It's common knowledge which of the two it is who weeps, the elderly father who finds his son alive following grief and despair, or the young man in his royal estate. So there's this kind of classic disagreement through different generations about which one of them cried. And I don't really care which is true. But I want to say that there is something very, very powerful about stories of family reconciliation, whether they're contemporary stories, and please God, we'll see those reconciliations soon, with hostages being reunited with their families right now. We'll see reconciliation throughout the world, like God willing, we'll see it. But whether it's reconciliation in our contemporary times, whether it's these incredible and painful stories of parents and children being separated in the Holocaust, or undocumented workers or immigrants being returned to their lands, whatever they might be, that we just recognize as human beings who have either sons or daughters, children, or ourselves parents, who recognize the power of human relationships that is so, the parent-child relationship. There is a reason why the only relative that we actually mourn for a whole year is a parent, according to Jewish tradition, because the bonds between a child and a parent are so incredibly deep, and we cannot, how can we not be moved by this story of Jacob and Joseph being reconciled? And if we are moved by it, and if we're human beings, then I think we are, then we have to be able to also see it in other different situations, in the horrific realities of the ways in which parents and children are separated from each other, and recognizing that who cares whether it's the father or the son who is the one who is weeping? They both weep. That's the point. If there are two opposing commentaries, then obviously they're both right. So both Jacob, even though it's in the singular, both Jacob and Joseph are weeping as they see each other for the first time. And there's something very powerful about it. So as we begin a new secular year, 2025, may we have the merit to see across the world and across different cultures, parents being reunited with their children, families being reunited and reconciled, including the painful rifts between our distant relatives across the world. And may we see that, may we feel it, and may we all weep tears when those reconciliations happen. Shabbat Shalom.